1930s, there was the phenomenon called the Dust Bowl, which is a mass drought that was extremely destructive to people. In the 1970s, there was an equivalent, after 40 more years of industrial development, there was an equivalent to the Dust Bowl, but almost no one even noticed because their ability to cope with it via irrigation and via other technology was so far developed. Or to take another example, in 1970, in Bangladesh, what's now Bangladesh, the Bay of Bengal, there was a tropical storm approximately the size and scope of Hurricane Katrina. Now, Hurricane Katrina, which was the most mismanaged disaster you can imagine by the United States government, and which was a tragedy how mismanaged it was, because so many lives were lost unnecessarily. Even with all the unnecessary lives that were lost, the casualties were 2,000 people. In the Bay of Bengal, with the equivalent storm, 300,000 people died. So the question is, when bad climate comes, whether from global warming or not, do you want industrial power or do you want windmills? That's the real question to ask. Now, the typical environmentalist perspective on this is that, again, any change in climate is a disaster. And I just want to read you one quote from Joe Romm, who's a very prominent global warming activist for the Center for American Progress, which is a prominent think tank, to give you the mentality, the opposite mentality. So what I'm arguing is factoring in the value of industrial civilization to any consequences of global warming puts them in the perspective of something that's very dealable with by human beings using their minds and technology. But let's see what Joe Romm says. He's talking about a sea level rise of 1 meter. And he says, by 1 meter, okay, by 2100 would be an unmitigated catastrophe for the planet. So so he believes, so let's think about this company. It's 2009 right now. Let's say you know there's 1 meter sea level rise. And you're anywhere, you're in Bangladesh or wherever. He's saying in the next 91 years, people can't figure out how to deal with sea level rises all the time, by the way, but of 1 meter, they can't figure out any way to displace the water. They can't, I mean, people are, there are a lot of people who need more water. You can't desalinate the water, you can't do anything in 91 years. Is this really his opinion of human being capacity to deal with the environment? I mean, so there's a complete lack of respect, a complete lack of appreciation for the incredible positive value of industrial civilization and capitalism. And for any of you who are interested in why this mentality exists and why it can put forward extremely destructive schemes, I really recommend reading Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged, which is this is a major theme of that book, is why people are so opposed to capitalism and to the very industries and the very people that keep us alive, the very atlases who hold the world on their shoulders. So for Joe Romm, 1 meter of sea level is an unmitigated catastrophe. One more quote from the environmental side. This is about coal, but he thinks the same thing about oil. This is James Hansen. He's a very famous NASA scientist who's very loved by the media. He's talking about coal, which provides about 40% of the power of the United States and provides the cheapest power, and was the instrumental form of power in raising our standard of living by about 30 years in a matter of decades. So this is what he says about coal. The trains carrying coal to power plants are death trains. Coal-fired power plants are factories of death. So remember that this is the proven way of keeping both the refrigerator on and the lights on. So my basic message is this. When you hear big oil, in particular, fossil fuels in general, big anything really, denounced as evil, remember the positive context of it. And if you hear someone else talking, tell them about what you know, and hopefully what you go on to learn about the positives of oil We've seen with DDT, really bad things can happen if we don't appreciate the positive of industrial civilization. If you want to see what a depression means, it's not what we have right now. It's not even the Great Depression, because at least in those periods, you're allowed to try to find energy. But if we deliberately say that 80% is off limits no matter what this kind of energy you can find, I mean, that is the most depressing depression that I can imagine. And anyone who claims about the third world and advocates such a thing is advocating the death of the third world. But on the other hand, if we recognize the value of industrial energy, the potential is limitless. What we have today, all the amazing things that we have today, are just the beginning. I gave out a handout with a couple websites, including my Twitter page. I put a link to some oil resources I have. And one of them is an article I had on the early energy industry. And it was before the government became incredibly involved in energy in all kinds of different ways. And what I found studying the early energy industry was that the industry it most resembled in my mind was the computer industry, because there were continuous innovations and developments. In every decade, there was a new form of energy that was better and cheaper and more potent, and it was exciting. And that's what energy could be like today. Oil has so much potential. There's so much potential untapped oil in the world if restrictions were lifted here and throughout the rest of the world, where it's unfortunately very controlled. And there's incredible potential with things like natural gas, incredible potential with things like nuclear. The energy future doesn't have to be gloomy. It can be such that energy is so cheap that it makes investment throughout the world to develop it extremely profitable for all involved. So that's the choice, and this is why on our oil website at the Iman Institute I say this, and I'll end with it. Oil, understand it, embrace it, defend it. Thanks. Sorry about that. So, any questions? Friendly, hostile, mail bombs, whatever. Girl in the back.
Okay. So, for your solution to climate change, you advocate that industrial society will advance enough that we will be able to defend ourselves from whatever change may occur.
Yeah, hypothetically.
But my question is that clearly that technology does not exist now, and we're going to have to pour money and research into funding that. If we're going to be doing that, why can't we fund alternative energy research? Because by just trying to address these problems that climate change might induce, you're treating the symptoms of the disease and not the disease. Like, why is it worth pouring money into research to fix symptoms and not pouring money into research to fix the problem?
See, I regard it, if we were to continue the analogy, I regard it more like the medicine is industrial civilization, and any kind of climate change associated with it is like a pinprick from a shot. So as far as you say we lack the solution, I didn't mean to imply that we're going to find magical new solutions, that we don't already have solutions. I have a solution. I'm perfectly fine right now with any kind of climate change that happens. I'm in Southern California. I'm going to keep track of the weather trends. At the moment, they've been, staying stagnant since about 1998, which climate change models just figured out, oh, well then we'll incorporate those. So they've incorporated them a little late, they incorporated them after, not before. So they still can't predict anything, but we're hoping that at some point they can predict something. So I'm going to watch those trends like anyone should. Like you should watch anything in the world, like the stock market. I'll watch the weather. And if the weather gets a little too hot for my taste, if it goes up 2 degrees on average, I might move to Northern California and, where my friends live that I currently make fun of because they don't have as good weather as I do. So we can't buy into this idea that the climate changing is inherently some sort of immense tragedy. We have all the tools right now of dealing with it. The only thing I meant in terms of other developments is, of course, we could have better tools, but there are poorer people in the world who lack, mostly because they lack the proper form of government, lack the means of really developing and creating wealth.